Welcome to the day. Now, protesters have returned to cities across Kenya with demonstrators demanding that President William Ruto step down. Police tried to deter the crowds with tear gas and water cannon and by closing key highways. The mostly young protesters continue to agitate against the president despite his decision to withdraw an unpopular finance bill that triggered protests and deadly violence last week.
The streets of Kenya's capital have turned into a public battleground. Demonstrations here are smaller than those of recent weeks, but the scenes are no less chaotic. Young people across the country are angry at a government they say doesn't understand their struggles.
Why are poor people want to be killed? I'm on the street because our president is a liar. He has lied many things. He has told the youth that he'll find jobs for them. There's no job now. That is the reason we are here in the street. We want him to go.
We must call for inclusivity in the decision-making processes. We're already hearing and seeing the president making moves, cutting down budgets, saying this will not happen, that will not happen. With whose consultation?
President William Ruto was forced to backtrack on a new finance bill that initially sparked the protests. The law would have increased taxes on everyday items, including bread and cooking oil. Kenyan opposition leaders have spoken out in support of the demonstrators and their demands.
We consider this to be Kenya's last best chance. The youth have given our country our last best chance. We either seize it and swim with it by implementing all their demands, or we ignore it and sink the country altogether.
On Tuesday, activists placed coffins in the streets of Nairobi to draw attention to the excessive force used by police. The state-funded Kenya National Commission on Human Rights said as well as those killed, hundreds are being seriously injured. And there have been dozens of cases of enforced or involuntary disappearances.
Dr. Jane Munga is a fellow in the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. Why are people still out on the streets, even though the government has dropped this controversial finance bill?
Thank you, Phil, for this opportunity to have this conversation. And yes, rightfully, as you say, the people are still on the streets, and we're beginning to now clearly see, and what is imagined is that the demonstrations also triggered other pressure points that were already there. And the first thing that we are beginning to show clearly is that young people are still very dissatisfied with the current situation that they find themselves in. And this is because Kenya is a very young country, and a lot of young people are still unemployed, and they still don't believe that they're being heard when they're trying to air their grievances, that they do not see a future or hope for themselves in this. So they're still calling for the government to listen to them. And also this is led because they have been seen a lot of politicians indulge in a lot of wealth or in opulence who have just come into office, and they believe there's still a huge governance issue that is within the country, and they would want to see drastic changes in this. And thirdly, one of the things that has also continued to exacerbate these issues is also the political rhetoric. The young people still feel that they have not been heard, there's still opportunity to be listened to, and they want a wider dialogue beyond the bill that first took them there. And so they still want to engage on the issues that are still on the table.
OK, but people have died during these protests, which, as we say, started about this finance bill. These grievances that you've talked about were clearly there before this set of protests, and clearly once the pressure has been released in this way, they're not going to go back quickly. But is the government really, having done a U-turn on the finance bill, going to say, yes, if you riot in the streets and burn things down, we will suddenly cure unemployment where we didn't do that before?
Yes, it's very unfortunate, and my heart goes out to the families and the young people who have lost their lives in this process. It's a very unfortunate turn of events. The solution to the problem that Kenya finds itself in, and the government finds itself in, is not an easy solution. It does not have an easy solution. And it's very multifaceted and has multiple layers of how we can even come to untangle that. But we have to start looking at this into the current situation has been, the tensions have been there for a while. So we need to first quell the tensions that are there, de-escalate the tension, the rhetoric, and having a resolve to at least address some of the key issues, especially those of governance, and for the young people to be heard, because I think there's still an opportunity for dialogue to happen, or meaningful dialogue, to where the young people feel that their voices are being heard. So that is one. Now, the second thing is, as I said, Kenya is a very young country. The issues of governance, even in itself, and unemployment will take time. Many economists can say that there's going to have to be, yes, short-term solutions that help chart the way forward, but then there'll also have to be long-term. But all these solutions need an environment that is peaceful, and one that is able to have a dialogue, an open dialogue or discussion on what is the best way forward. So diffusing the current situation is very important, right. And then having a very strong conversation on how can the country move forward.
One of the big problems that's holding the country back is Kenya's debt problem. It has a debt problem and an IMF problem, and the expansion of the tax base was supposed to help fill this financial hole. Anything that the president does now in terms of austerity in trying to fill that hole surely is going to make whatever problems are there now for young, unemployed people worse.
And this is true, and that's why I say this is very complicated, because indeed there is a debt problem. Indeed, Kenya does need to raise revenue for its outputs. So we need to find creative ways, and I think it really calls for a lot of advice and wisdom, even just to put it that way, simple, basic wisdom on the part of the leadership at this point to see how to ensure that the measures of raising revenue are not going to make a situation worse. Young people, or even general Kenyans, still are not able to just provide for the very basics. So any raise of taxation cannot also be pinching on the current base of the income that they have. It needs to be a way that it diversifies this, but also it has a long-term strategy to ensure that it is also putting back some kind of revenue back into these people's pockets. Because the problem right now is when you put more taxes that are clearly going directly into the pocket, then it becomes a big issue. People don't feel like you're listening to us. You're not hearing the cries of the people. So it's going to become a lot of conversation. How do we do this? How do we expand this tax base? Is it more borrowing, more lending? But at the end of the day, it also has to be advised by the current situation on the ground.
All right, good talking to you. Thanks for talking us through that. Dr. Jane Munga from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Thank you very much.
DW's Edith Kimani joins us now from Nairobi. Edith, describe to us what's happening out on the streets in the capital today.
Well, the situation has played out much like it is where we are, where police have been engaging protesters in running battles. The strategy today from the police officers, having learned from the protests last week, was to come into these low-income, densely populated areas where a lot of young people are and keep them in their neighborhoods, to keep them from going into the city center where they were to hold these large demonstrations. And so this is a situation where we're at. The police officers seem to be leaving, but tear gas still ringing in the air. We can smell it all around us. And what we're seeing is a major highway that's supposed to be connecting Nairobi to major cities and towns, but at the moment temporarily closed as police try to figure out how to contain the young protesters, who, by the way, are all around me in a kind of civic civic midpoint, not able to participate, but also not wanting to be left behind.
Now, the president withdrew the bill, didn't he, that initially brought protesters out onto the streets. So what is it that's bringing people back onto the streets now?
Well, people are saying that the Reject Finance Bill protests were just the beginning, and it gave them a framework and an opportunity to really air out the grievances that they've been holding on to. Key among them, they want the president and indeed the security officers to take responsibility for those who have died during these protests, and they want to see head rolls. They also want to see a restructuring in the kind of governance that's in this country, the kind of exaggerated spending that we've been seeing. They want that to stop. And finally, they definitely want to see President Ruto step down.
So how dangerous is this situation for the president, really? I mean, are these protests an actual threat to his government?
If you ask President William Ruto, he will say no. In fact, in a recent interview that lasted nearly 2 hours, he saw it rather as an opportunity to extend an olive branch to the young people and have collaborative talks, as he's saying. But for the young people, they're saying that this is no time for talks, and that he and the entirety of his government must step down. Now, of course, the Constitution of Kenya is very categorical about how and in what way that could happen. And so it's highly unlikely that convinced that they're going to get what they want.
DW's correspondent Edith Kimani in Nairobi. Edith, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there.